Sometimes the wilderness is the only place left where grief makes sense. After burying her husband and walking away from a family that had grown silent over the years, 62-year-old Maida Rusk headed alone into Montana's Bitterroot Mountains, seeking nothing but quiet. On her third morning, a small grey wolf pup appeared on her trail. It was limping and half-starved, but it wouldn't leave. Maida tried everything to scare it off. Wolves don't follow humans. They don't trust. They don't beg. So why wouldn't this one go away? What she didn't realize was that this tiny creature would lead her to an old cabin hidden deep in the forest and to a family secret that would change everything she believed about her past. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Maida Rusk had spent 40 years learning the language of the Bitterroot Mountains. She knew the difference between the whisper of pine and the rustle of aspen. She could read weather in the color of the sky 2 hours before it arrived. She understood which ridgelines held snow longest and which valleys flooded first when spring finally broke winter's back. The mountains had been her classroom, her workplace, her sanctuary, and now, 3 months after burying her husband Tom, they were her escape. The morning she left Darby, Montana, the sky hung low and grey, promising nothing. She'd packed her truck in silence, loading her gear with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done it 1,000 times before. 70-pound pack, tent, sleeping bag rated to 15 below. Camp stove, water filter, first aid kit, rope, knife. The leather-bound trail journal she'd kept since she was 22, its pages filled with decades of observations about animal tracks, weather patterns, and the quiet thoughts that only came when you were alone with the wild. Her neighbor, old Frank Kowalski, had stood at his fence watching her load up. He didn't ask where she was going or when she'd be back. He just raised one weathered hand in a wave that said he understood. In a town like Darby, everyone knew about Tom. Heart attack at 64, sudden as a lightning strike. Dropped dead in the garden while planting tomatoes, gone before the ambulance arrived. They'd been married 38 years. Not all of them happy, but most of them good, solid, built on shared work and mutual respect more than romance. Tom had been a carpenter, practical and steady, a man who fixed things. When he died, Maida realized she didn't know how to fix the silence he left behind. Her children hadn't come back for long. David lived in Seattle now, worked in tech, had 2 kids Maida barely knew. He'd stayed 3 days after the funeral, awkward and checking his phone, eager to get back to his real life. Her daughter Lynn had flown in from Phoenix, cried through the service, and left the next, mourning with promises to visit soon that Maida knew were empty. They'd call on holidays. Maybe. The distance between them had grown slowly, over years. Maida couldn't pinpoint when it started. Maybe when they went to college and realized their mother was more comfortable in the wilderness than at soccer games. Maybe when they started their own families and she didn't know how to be the grandmother who baked cookies and remembered birthdays. She loved them fiercely, but she'd never learned how to show it in ways they understood. So when the house became too quiet and Tom's tools still hung in the garage and his coffee cup still sat on the counter because she couldn't bring herself to put it away, Maida did what she'd always done when life became too much. She went to the mountains. She drove the logging road as far as it went, then shouldered her pack and started walking. The trailhead was familiar, worn smooth by her boots over decades of guiding trips. She'd brought countless people into this backcountry honeymooners wanting adventure, corporate groups doing team building, retirees checking national parks off their bucket lists. She'd taught them how to hang bear bags and read topographic maps. She'd shown them where to find wild strawberries in July and explained why you never camped in a drainage when storms threatened. But she hadn't been out alone, truly alone, in years. Tom had worried. He'd made her promise to always file a trip plan, to carry the satellite phone, to check in. She'd filed the trip plan at the ranger station out of habit, but the satellite phone sat in a drawer at home. She didn't want anyone checking in. She didn't want questions or concern. She wanted the kind of silence that only came when you were days from the nearest road. The first day, she walked 12 miles. The rhythm came back easily, the steady pace, the way you breathed with the terrain, the focus that narrowed to nothing but the trail ahead and the weight on your back. Her knees ached more than they used to. Her shoulders would be sore tomorrow. But the familiar pain was almost welcome. It was clean, honest, earned. She made camp that night beside a creek she'd camped beside 100 times before. The ritual was automatic: pitch the tent, filter water. Boil water for the freeze-dried meal that all tasted the same but filled your belly. Hang the bear bag. Sit on a rock and watch the light fade while your body settled into the exhaustion that was the only thing that let you sleep anymore. She pulled out her trail journal as the last light bled from the sky. The pen felt familiar in her hand. She'd filled 11 of these journals over 40 years, each one documenting trips and observations, sketches of animal tracks, notes about trail conditions. They sat on a shelf at home, a record of a life lived mostly outside. Today she wrote, Day 1, 12 miles to Sleeping Woman Creek, weather clear, cold, saw elk sign, fresh. Tom would have liked this spot. We camped here on our 2nd anniversary. She stopped, stared at the words. It was the first time she'd written his name since he died. Her hand shook slightly. She closed the journal and tucked it away. The second day was harder. Her body protested the pack, the elevation, the cold that settled into her bones in the morning. She was 62, and she felt it. But she pushed through, climbing steadily toward the high country. The trail thinned, became less maintained. This was the transition zone, where casual hikers turned back and only the serious kept going. By evening, she'd covered another 10 miles. She was deep enough now that the silence felt complete. No plane engines overhead, no distant highway hum. Just wind and water and the small sounds of a forest settling in for night. She made camp in a stand of lodgepole pine and ate her dinner without tasting it. That night, lying in her tent, she let herself cry for the first time since the funeral. It came in waves, wrenching and silent, her face pressed into her sleeping bag. She cried for Tom, for the empty house, for her children who'd grown into strangers, for all the years that had somehow passed while she wasn't paying attention. She cried until she had nothing left, then fell asleep with her face still wet. The third morning, she woke to frost on the tent and her breath misting in the cold. Her body ached everywhere. For a long moment, she considered turning back. This trip was supposed to help, supposed to give her clarity or peace or whatever people found when they went into the wilderness to sort out their lives. So far, it just felt lonely. She crawled out of the tent, stiff and sore, and started making coffee on her camp stove. The morning air smelled of pine and stone and the clean emptiness of high altitude. She was at nearly 8,000 feet now, above most of the timber, in the rocky transition zone before tree line. That's when she saw it. 30 yards away, standing at the edge of the clearing, was a wolf pup. Small, maybe 4 months old, with grey-brown fur and oversized paws it hadn't grown into yet. It stood perfectly still, watching her with pale yellow eyes that held more intelligence than any domestic dog she'd ever seen. Maida froze. Wolves were rare in these mountains now, though they'd been coming back over the past decade. She'd seen them a few times over the years, always at a distance, always fleeting. They didn't approach humans, they didn't linger, they certainly didn't stand and stare like this one was doing. She clapped her hands sharply. "Get out of here!" The pup flinched, but didn't run. It took 2 steps back, still watching. She picked up a stick and threw it. "Go on, get!" The pup dodged the stick, retreated another few steps, then sat down. Just sat there, looking at her with those unsettling eyes. Maida stared back. Something was wrong with it. She could see that now. It was too thin, ribs showing through its fur, and it was favoring its right front leg, not putting full weight on it. Young, alone, injured. The pack must have left it behind. It wouldn't survive on its own, but that wasn't her problem. Wolves were wild animals. You didn't interfere. You definitely didn't feed them or encourage them to associate humans with food. That was rule number 1. She turned her back deliberately, finished making her coffee, broke down her camp. When she shouldered her pack and started walking, she didn't look back. The pup would leave. It had to. By midday, she knew it was following her. She'd catch glimpses, a flash of grey moving through the trees, 50 yards back, always at a distance, always careful. She stopped several times and tried to scare it off, yelled, threw rocks, made herself big and threatening. Each time it retreated, waited, then resumed following when she started walking again. It made no sense. Wolves didn't do this. Even pups had an instinctive wariness of humans. This one should have been terrified of her. Instead, it followed like it had decided she was the only option left. By the time she made camp that evening, she'd given up trying to drive it away. It sat at the edge of the clearing, watching her set up her tent. She could see it clearly now in the evening light. Definitely injured, that right paw was swollen. Definitely starving, its belly was hollow, its fur dull. It couldn't hunt properly with that injury, and it was too young to know how to survive alone. Maida ate her dinner, trying to ignore those yellow eyes watching every bite. When she hung her bear bag, she hesitated, then left a few pieces of jerky on a rock at the edge of camp before retreating to her tent. She lay awake, listening. After a while, she heard the soft sound of the pup approaching, the quick snap of jaws taking the food. Then silence. She fell asleep with the strange knowledge that for the first time in 3 months, she wasn't entirely alone. The 4th morning, the pup was still there. It had spent the night at the edge of her camp, curled into a tight ball near a fallen log. When Maida emerged from her tent, it lifted its head, but didn't move. In the early light, she could see it more clearly. The matted fur, the dull eyes, the trembling that wasn't entirely from cold. It was dying, slowly, and it seemed to know it. She should have packed up and moved on. Instead, she found herself studying the injured paw. The swelling suggested an infection, probably from a thorn or bite that had gone bad. Without treatment, the pup would be dead in a week. Maybe less. "This is a bad idea," she said aloud. The pup's ears swiveled toward her voice, but it didn't move. "You know that, right? I can't take care of you. I don't even know what I'm doing out here." The pup just watched her with those unsettling pale eyes. Maida sighed, dug through her first aid kit, and pulled out antibiotic ointment and clean gauze. She approached slowly, talking in a low, steady voice. The pup tensed, but didn't run. When she knelt 3 feet away, it growled, a weak sound that would have been threatening if it came from a healthy adult, but just sounded desperate, coming from this starving youngster. "Easy," Maida murmured. "I'm trying to help." She tossed a piece of jerky between them. The pup lunged for it, gulped it down. She tossed another, closer to herself. The pup hesitated, then crept forward and took it. They repeated this dance until the pup was close enough that Maida could slowly, carefully reach out and touch its injured paw. The pup yelped and tried to jerk away, but Maida held firm, her voice steady and calm. "I know it hurts. I know. Let me see." She worked quickly, cleaning the wound as best she could, applying the antibiotic ointment, wrapping the paw in gauze. The pup whined and trembled but didn't bite. When she finished, she let it go and sat back. The pup retreated a few steps, then sat down and began licking at the bandage. "Leave it alone," Maida said. "Let it work." She made coffee and ate breakfast while the pup watched. This time, she deliberately left a larger portion of food out. The pup devoured it with an intensity that made her chest ache. When had she last eaten? Days? Longer. As Maida broke camp, she noticed something she'd missed before. Around the pup's neck, barely visible beneath the matted fur, was a piece of rope. Not natural, not caught accidentally. Someone had put a collar on this wolf. She approached again, more confident now. The pup allowed it, too exhausted to protest. Maida examined the rope carefully. It was frayed and old, had been on the animal for weeks at least. She worked it over the pup's head and held it up to the light. Just simple rope, the kind you could buy at any hardware store. But the knot was deliberate. Someone had kept this wolf. Someone had handled it enough that it didn't have the pure wildness it should have had. "Where did you come from?" Maida asked quietly. "Who had you?" The pup just stared. At her. She tucked the rope into her pack, though she wasn't sure why. Evidence of something, though she didn't know what. Then she started walking. The pup followed, closer now, limping on 3 legs but determined. By midday, Maida realized she'd given up on scaring it away. The pup, she'd started thinking of it as Scout, though she hadn't said the name aloud yet, was simply part of the landscape now. It followed 10 yards behind, stopped when she stopped, rested when she rested. When she crossed a creek, it crossed too, though the cold water made it yelp. They made camp that evening in a meadow Maida had visited countless times over the years. It had always been one of her favorite spots, a natural clearing surrounded by pine and fir, with a view of the high peaks to the east. She'd brought clients here, had shown them how to identify constellations, and explained why the meadow grass grew in patterns that followed ancient game trails. Tonight, she set up her tent, filtered water, and cooked dinner while Scout watched from the edge of the clearing. When she deliberately set out food, the pup approached without hesitation now, ate quickly, then retreated to a respectful distance. It was learning the routine, understanding that she was a source of food and relative safety. As darkness fell and the temperature dropped, Scout crept closer to the tent. By the time Maida crawled into her sleeping bag, the pup was curled just outside the tent door, close enough that she could hear its breathing. She lay awake, listening to the small sounds it made, and felt something unfamiliar stir in her chest. Not quite hope, but something adjacent to it. Purpose, maybe. Or just the simple fact of being needed by something other than herself. The next morning, Scout was still there. Its paw looked better already, the swelling reduced. It watched Maida with less wariness now, more curiosity. When she started walking, it followed without hesitation. They fell into a rhythm over the Chondrus. Next 2 days. Walk, rest, camp. She changed Scout's bandage each evening, and the pup allowed it with increasing trust. She found herself talking to it as they walked, filling the silence with observations about the landscape, thoughts about Tom, memories of guiding trips from years past. Scout never responded, just followed with its steady 3-legged gait. On the 6th day, something changed. They'd been moving through familiar territory, following established trails that Maida knew as well as the lines on her own palm. But late in the afternoon, Scout stopped following. Instead, it moved ahead, paused at a game trail that branched off the main path, and looked back at Maida. "Wrong way," Maida said. "We're going this way." Scout didn't move, just stood there looking at her, then at the game trail. Maida frowned. The game trail led northeast, deeper into the backcountry, toward terrain she knew less well. There was nothing up there but dense forest, and eventually the wilderness, area boundary. No reason to go that direction. "Come on," she said, continuing on the main trail. Scout didn't follow. When Maida looked back, the pup was still standing at the junction, watching her. After a moment, it barked once, a sharp sound that echoed through the trees. Maida stopped. Wolves didn't bark. Dogs barked. But wolves vocalized differently. Howls, whines, growls, but not the sharp, deliberate bark of a domestic animal trying to communicate with a human. She walked back to where Scout stood. The pup immediately started down the game trail, looked back, waited. "You want me to go this way?" Maida said slowly. "Why?" Scout barked again, then trotted a few steps down the trail. Every instinct told Maida this was foolish. following a wolf pup into unfamiliar territory, deviating from her planned route, all because an injured animal seemed to have an opinion about where they should go. It was the kind of decision that led to people getting lost or hurt in the wilderness. But she thought about the rope collar. Someone had handled this wolf, someone had kept it, then either released it or lost it. And somehow it had found her specifically, had followed her specifically, in mountains vast enough to swallow a person whole. That wasn't accident. That was intention. She pulled out her topographic map and studied it. The game trail Scout wanted to follow headed toward a drainage she'd only visited once or twice in 40 years. Steep country, thick timber, no reason to go there unless you were hunting elk or looking for solitude. But as she traced the contour lines with her finger, something nagged at her memory. Something about that area. She dug through her pack, moving aside gear until she found what she was looking for, an old map she didn't remember packing. It was yellowed and creased, the paper soft with age. Her father's map, she realized. James Rusk had been a wilderness guide too, had taught her everything she knew. He'd died 10 years ago, and she'd inherited his old gear, his notes, his maps. This one was covered in pencil marks, annotations in her father's cramped handwriting, trail conditions, water sources, good camping spots. And in the area Scout wanted her to explore, several X marks with no explanation, just X marks, clustered together like markers for something important. She stared at those marks, trying to remember. Had her father ever talked about that area? Had they ever gone there together? She looked up at Scout. The pup was waiting patiently, watching her with those intelligent yellow eyes. "You know something?" Maida said quietly. "Don't you? You're trying to show me something." Scout's tail wagged once, a tentative motion. Maida folded the map, made a decision. "All right, we'll try it your way. But this better be important." She turned onto the game trail, and Scout immediately trotted ahead, moving with more energy than she'd seen from the injured pup yet. Whatever was in that direction, Scout knew it, needed her to know it too. They walked until dark, following the narrow trail through increasingly dense forest. When they finally made camp, Maida was in territory she barely recognized. The mountains looked different here, the trees older and more tightly packed. But Scout seemed confident, relaxed even, as if they were heading toward home. The landscape changed over the next 3 days. They descended into a drainage thick with old-growth timber, trees so large that 3 people couldn't have circled their trunks with linked arms. The undergrowth was dense, and the trail, if you could call it that, required constant attention. Maida found herself relying on Scout to choose the path, the pup navigating with a certainty that suggested familiarity. Scout's paw was healing well. The bandage had come off on day 8, and though the pup still favored the leg slightly, it no longer limped. Its coat had regained some luster from regular feeding, and its eyes had brightened. It was still thin, still too young to be thriving alone, but it was surviving. They'd settled into a comfortable partnership. Scout ranged ahead during the day, occasionally disappearing into the brush to investigate something only it could smell, but always circling back. At night, the pup slept close to Maida's tent, sometimes so close she could feel its warmth through the fabric. She'd given up pretending she wasn't attached. On the 9th morning, Maida sat by her camp stove, warming her hands on a cup of coffee, while Scout gnawed on a portion of dried meat. The pup had learned her routine completely now, knew when she'd pack up, when they'd walk, when she'd stop to rest. It was almost domestic, except for the wildness that still flickered in its eyes when it heard sounds in the forest. She pulled out the photograph she'd discovered the previous evening. It had been in the inside pocket of her jacket, tucked into a fold she rarely used. She didn't remember putting it there. The photo, there was old, the colors faded, the edges soft with age. It showed a young girl, maybe 8 years old, standing with her father and an older boy in front of a log cabin. The girl was unmistakably Maida. She recognized her own gap-toothed smile, her wild, dark hair. Her father looked younger than she could really remember him being, his face unlined, his hair still dark. And the boy, her brother, Michael. Maida's breath caught. She had a brother. She'd had a brother. He died when she was young, and the family had never really talked about it afterward. The silence around his death had been so complete that she'd learned not to ask questions, and over the years the memories had faded until they were more like dreams than actual experiences. But here was proof. Michael had been real. He'd been tall even as a kid, lean and dark-haired like their father. In the photo, he was smiling, one hand on young Maida's shoulder in a protective older brother gesture. He looked maybe 14 or 15. How old had she been when he died? 11? 12? The details were fuzzy, deliberately forgotten, and behind them in the photo, a cabin. Log construction, small, with a covered porch and a stone chimney, a place she'd never seen before. Or had she? The longer she stared at it, the more something stirred in her memory. A feeling more than an image, summer warmth, the smell of pine, laughter, being safe. Scout approached and sniffed the photograph, then looked up at Maida with what seemed like expectation. "You know about this, don't you?" Maida said quietly. "This is where you're taking me." Scout's tail wagged. She studied the photo again, trying to pull more details from the faded image. There were mountains in the background, but that didn't help. There were mountains everywhere out here. No other landmarks, no signs or identifiable features. Just a cabin in the forest and 3 people who looked happy. When had this been taken? Summer, obviously, based on their clothing. She was maybe 8, which would have made it, she counted backward, 1971, over 50 years ago. If there had been a family cabin, why didn't she remember it clearly? Why had they stopped going there? What had happened to Michael? She tucked the photo back into her pocket and looked at Scout. "Is this where you came from?" "The cabin." Scout stood, stretched, and began trotting down the trail without looking back. A clear answer, if you chose to read it that way. They walked for 6 hours that day, following Scout's confident lead through terrain that grew increasingly unfamiliar. Maida consulted her father's map repeatedly, trying to match landmarks to the penciled X marks. They were getting close, she could feel it, though she couldn't have explained how. Late in the afternoon, they came to a creek. It was wider than most they'd crossed, running fast and cold with snowmelt from the high country. Scout stopped at the bank, sniffed the air, then waded in without hesitation. The water came up to its chest, but the pup pushed through, scrambled up the far bank, and shook itself dry. Maida followed, the icy water making her gasp even through her boots. As she climbed the opposite bank, Scout barked once and pawed at something in the mud. It was a toy. A small metal truck, rusted and half-buried, but unmistakable. Maida knelt and pulled it free, her hands shaking. She knew this truck. The memory hit her like a physical blow. Michael playing with it, making engine sounds, racing it through the dirt. He'd loved trucks, had collected a dozen of them, kept them lined up on a shelf in his room. This one had been his favorite. Red paint, though most of it had flaked away now. She'd been jealous of it once, had asked if she could play with it, and Michael had said yes, but made her promise to be careful. She turned it over in her hands, feeling the weight of decades between then and now. Michael had been here. This place, wherever they were, had been real. The cabin in the photo was real. And she'd been here too, young and thoughtless, not knowing that these would become lost memories she'd have to excavate from the mud of her own mind. "We spent summers here," she said aloud, the words feeling true as she spoke them. "The whole family, Mum and Dad and Michael and me. This was our place." Scout sat watching her, patient and calm. "But why did we stop coming? What happened?" The creek gurgled past, offering no answers. Maida pocketed the truck next to the photograph and stood. The sun was getting low. They'd need to make camp soon. But she could feel they were close now. Whatever Scout was leading her toward, it was near. They found a flat spot 50 yards from the creek and set up camp. Maida worked mechanically, her mind elsewhere, sifting through fragments of memory. She remembered this forest, she was almost certain. The way the light slanted through the trees, the smell of the earth after rain, the sound of a screen door banging, but the memories were scattered, incomplete, like a puzzle with half the pieces missing. That night, she pulled out her father's map again and studied it by flashlight. The X marks were clustered in this area, within a mile of where they'd camped. Her father had been back here, had documented something. But when? And why had he never told her? She opened her trail journal to a fresh page and began to write, trying to capture the swirling thoughts before they faded. The photo, the toy truck, Michael's face, which she could barely remember now despite seeing it in the picture. The cabin that existed somewhere in her memory and somewhere in these mountains, waiting to be found. Scout lay pressed against the side of the tent, close enough that Maida could feel its weight against the fabric. She found the contact comforting. For weeks now, she'd been alone with her grief, circling it like a drain, unable to find purchase. But now, something had shifted. The grief was still there for Tom, for her distant children, for all the years that had passed without her noticing. But alongside it now was something else. Curiosity, maybe, or purpose. The simple fact of a mystery that needed solving. She closed the journal and turned off the flashlight. Tomorrow they'd find the cabin. She was sure of it. Scout knew where it was, had been leading her there all along. And when they found it, maybe she'd finally understand why her family had erased this place from their history. Maybe she'd understand what happened to Michael, how he died, why his name had become something they didn't speak. Or maybe she'd just find an old, abandoned cabin and a handful of ruined memories. But either way, she had to know. She fell asleep, listening to Scout's breathing and the sound of the creek, and dreamed of summer days and a brother's laughter and the feeling of being young enough to believe that nothing bad would ever happen. They found the cabin on the 10th day. Scout led her up a gentle slope, through a stand of pine so thick the ground was carpeted with decades of needles. The trees gave way suddenly to a clearing, and there it was exactly as it appeared in the photograph. Though older now, weathered and worn by 50 years of mountain weather, Maida stopped at the edge of the clearing, her heart hammering. The cabin stood silent, its log walls silvered with age, the roof sagging slightly but still intact. The porch where they'd posed for the photo was still there, the boards grey and warped. The stone chimney rose from the center of the structure, a few stones missing near the top, but otherwise solid. Windows, dark and empty, stared back at her like vacant eyes. Scout trotted directly to the cabin, climbed the porch steps without hesitation, and scratched at the door. "You've been here before," Maida said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is your home, isn't it? Someone here had you." She approached slowly, half expecting the cabin to vanish like a mirage. But it remained solid, real, waiting. At the edge of the clearing, she spotted a weathered wooden sign hanging from a post, Rusk Family Camp. Carved into the wood beneath were 4 names: James, Margaret, Michael, Maida. She reached out and touched the sign, tracing her own name with one finger. Margaret, her mother. She'd died 12 years ago, cancer taking her slowly. Maida had cared for her at the end, but their relationship had never been warm. Her mother had been distant, locked behind walls Maida never learned to breach. Looking at the sign now, Maida wondered if those walls had been built here, in this place. Scout barked impatiently from the porch. "I'm coming," Maida said. The door wasn't locked. It had no lock at all, just a simple latch. She lifted it and pushed. The door swung inward with a groan of old hinges, and dust motes swirled in the shaft of light that fell across the threshold. Inside, the cabin was frozen in time. Furniture sat exactly where it had been left: a wooden table with 4 chairs, a sofa with faded cushions, a rocking chair near the fireplace. Kitchen area along one wall with a hand pump over a basin. 2 doors led to what must be bedrooms. Everything was thick with dust, but preserved. Maida walked in slowly, Scout at her heels. The air smelled of old wood and dust and abandonment. But underneath that, she could almost smell other things: coffee, wood smoke, her mother's soap. On the walls hung photographs in simple frames. She recognized some her parents' wedding picture, a photo of her grandfather. But in the corner, at child height, she found children's drawings tacked to the log walls. Crude pictures in crayon and pencil. She recognized her own childish handwriting on one, Maida, age 7. And next to it, in neater letters, Michael, age 13, best summer ever. She touched the drawing, her fingers trembling. This had been their special place. The family would come here for summers, weeks at a time. She could remember it now, the memories flooding back, swimming in the creek, helping her father chop wood, Michael teaching her to skip stones, long evenings around the fireplace. They'd been happy here. Scout had moved to the far corner and was pawing at something. Maida crossed to investigate and found a large wooden chest with metal corners and a heavy padlock. Scout scratched at it persistently, whining. "What's in there?" Maida asked. "What do you want me to find?" She tried the lock, but it held firm. Everything else in the cabin had been left open, but this was locked deliberately. Something someone had wanted to protect or hide. She explored further. The first bedroom held a double bed, a dresser with drawers of folded clothes. Her parents' room. The second bedroom had bunk beds. She'd slept in the bottom bunk, she remembered suddenly. Michael had the top. On Michael's bunk, she found a pillow with a faded superhero case. Batman. He'd loved Batman. She picked it up, held it to her chest, and let herself cry for the brother she'd forgotten. Scout appeared in the doorway and whined softly. "I'm okay," Maida said, wiping her eyes. "I just forgot him. I forgot all of this." She set the pillow down and returned to the main room. The chest still sat in the corner, locked. Scout was lying beside it, watching her. "The key," Maida said. "Where would they have kept it?" She searched systematically, checked drawers, shelves, behind frames. Nothing. The key was either taken or hidden. Finally, she stepped outside. The sun was past its peak. She walked around the cabin's perimeter, studying it. Behind the structure, she found a small shed. Inside was exactly what you'd expect: tools, equipment. She was about to turn away when something caught her eye, a fishing tackle box on a shelf. She pulled it down and opened it. Inside, amid ancient lures, was a small brass key. Her heart jumped. She carried it back to the cabin, knelt by the chest, and tried it in the padlock. It slid in smoothly, clicked, and the lock popped open. Inside the chest were papers, journals, letters, photographs, a leather-bound book that looked like a diary. At the bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, was a hunting knife in a worn sheath, carved into the handle. M.R. Michael Rusk. Scout pressed against her side. Maida set the knife down and reached for the diary. She opened to the first entry, written in teenage handwriting, the 15th of June, 1977. "Dad brought us to the cabin today." Maida's excited. She always loves it here. She turned pages, scanning entries. Michael writing about fishing, hiking, teaching his little sister things. Normal summer stuff. But the entries changed tone. The 3rd of July, 1977. "Found something strange today up on the ridge. Traps, but not legal ones. Dad says not to touch them." He looked scared. The 10th of July, 1977. "Dad went back to check the traps. He won't tell me what's going on, but I followed him. He was taking photos." The 18th of July, 1977. "Heard voices last night. Men, angry. Dad told us to. Stay inside. After they left, he said we might go home early. The wolf pelts in their truck. The blood." Maida's hands shook. She flipped ahead. The 2nd of August, 1977. "Last day at the cabin. Dad says we won't come back. I know it's because of the men killing wolves. He's scared. The entries stopped there. But in the chest were other papers. Letters written by her father years later. She pulled one out. Margaret, I can't stop thinking about that summer, about what Michael saw. I should have reported it. Instead I ran. And now... The letter ended, unfinished. Maida's mind raced. Michael had discovered poachers. Her father had known but hadn't reported it. They'd abandoned the cabin. And Michael, she pulled out more papers. A newspaper clipping, yellow and fragile. Local man dies in climbing accident. Maida Rusk, 20, of Darby, Montana, was found dead at the base of Timber Creek Ridge. Authorities say the death appears accidental. Timber Creek Ridge, 15 miles from here, Michael, died at 26 years after that summer. The article said, accident. But sitting here, surrounded by his journal and her father's guilt, Maida wondered, had it really been an accident? Maida spent that night in the cabin. She couldn't bring herself to leave. Not yet. She built a fire in the old stone fireplace, surprised when the chimney still drew properly. Scout curled beside her as she read through her father's papers by firelight. The letters painted a picture of a man consumed by guilt. Her father had written dozens, most unsent, working through his thoughts on paper. He'd seen the poachers that summer in 1977, known they were killing wolves illegally. He'd taken photographs as evidence, but had been too frightened to report it. The poachers had made threats, and he'd had a family to protect, so he'd taken them away and never returned to the cabin. But in 1983, Michael had come back. He was 20, finishing his degree in wildlife biology. According to the letters, Michael had become obsessed with wolf conservation, determined to expose the poaching operation. James had begged him not to go. Michael had gone anyway. 3 weeks later, he was dead at Timber Creek Ridge, officially ruled an accident, but her father never believed it. He'd spent years trying to prove murder, trying to find evidence, but he'd had nothing solid. A letter dated 1995. I failed him. I should have been braver in 77, should have reported what we saw. Michael would still be alive. Now it's too late. The poachers are probably gone, and I'm just an old man who can't let go. She set it down, vision blurred. Her father had carried this guilt forever. It explained things, his sadness, his distance, the long hours alone in the mountains. He'd been punishing himself, searching for something he'd never find, and she'd never known. They'd hidden it all from her. She'd been 11 when Michael died. They told her it was an accident, discouraged questions, erased him from conversation. Protecting her, she supposed, or protecting themselves. Scout stirred, ears pricked. Maida heard it too, something outside. She tensed, reaching for her father's rifle from above the mantel. It was loaded. She moved to the window and peered out. Beyond the firelight, movement, a larger wolf, adult-sized, standing at the clearing's edge. It watched the cabin, eyes reflecting green. Scout whined softly. The adult wolf lingered, then disappeared into the trees. Maida exhaled. Scout's mother, maybe. Either way, the message was clear they were being watched. She returned to the papers. Among her father's notes, a hand-drawn map showed the cabin, the creek, and a trail to Timber Creek Ridge. Several locations marked with X symbols, the same marks from her topographic map. Sites where her father had found poaching evidence. One notation: March 1996 fresh wolf tracks near the ridge. Still active? 1. 14 years after Michael's death. Her father had still been investigating. The obsession never left him. She compared it to her topographic map. The marks aligned. He'd been thorough, documenting everything over years. He must have come back regularly, probably lying about guiding trips, searching for evidence that would vindicate his suspicions. He'd never found it. Maida studied the maps until the fire burned low. Timber Creek Ridge was 15 miles northeast, difficult terrain but manageable, 2 days to reach where Michael died. But why would she? What would that accomplish? Michael had been dead over 40 years. The men who killed him, if they had, were probably dead or gone. But Scout had led her here for a reason. Someone had put that collar on the pup, sent it to find her specifically. Why? She looked at Scout. You're not just a lost pup. Someone trained you. Someone who knew about this cabin, about my family. Someone who wanted me to find this. Scout's tail thumped. But who? And why now? No answer came. Maida added wood to the fire and wrapped herself in her sleeping bag on the old sofa. Scout jumped up and curled against her legs. Outside, the forest was full of night sounds, wind, the creek, a distant owl. She thought about Tom. He'd tell her to call the rangers, report what she'd found, let professionals handle it. Tom had been practical, cautious. He'd loved her but never really understood her need for wilderness, her comfort with risk from decades of experience. But Tom was gone, and she was here, and she had a choice. She could pack up tomorrow, hike back, hand her father's papers to authorities, let them investigate if they wanted, though 40 years cold meant nothing. Go home to her empty house and resume her empty life and forget this the way she'd forgotten Michael. Or she could follow this to the end. Go to Timber Creek Ridge, see where her brother died, try to understand what happened. Maybe put some ghosts to rest, her father's, Michael's, her own. Scout's breathing deepened. Maida stared at the fire and made her decision. She'd come out here to grieve Tom, to process loss. But maybe grief wasn't the point anymore. Maybe this was about justice delayed but not denied, about finishing what her father started, about honoring a brother who deserved better than being forgotten. Tomorrow, they'd head for Timber Creek Ridge. Whatever she found, at least she'd know. And knowing was better than the silence her family had lived with for 4 decades. They left the cabin at first light. Maida packed carefully her father's map, Michael's journal, important letters. She also took the hunting rifle and ammunition. If the poaching operation was still active, she wanted to be prepared. Scout moved with purpose, following game trails northeast. The terrain grew more difficult, steeper slopes, rockier ground, dense undergrowth, requiring careful navigation. By midday, they'd covered 6 miles. Maida rested beside a spring that bubbled from granite. She filtered water while Scout ranged in circles, nose down. She studied her father's map. According to his notations, they should reach the first marked site within another mile. She wasn't sure what she'd find. After 40 years, evidence would be gone. But an hour later, Scout led her to a clearing on a ridge, and she stopped, cold. Fresh tracks. Multiple sets, human-sized, recent. Someone had been here within days. She knelt and examined them carefully. 2 people, maybe 3. They'd stood here a while. And they'd been carrying something heavy, deeper impressions, where they'd set items down. Scout whined and pawed at something. Maida brushed away dirt to reveal a cigarette butt. Not ancient. Fresh. Her pulse quickened. Someone was still using this area, and based on the location matching her father's marked sites for the same purpose. Poaching. She looked around more carefully. Scratch marks on a tree trunk, the kind made by wire snares, a broken branch showing the snap pattern of something heavy being dragged. And the smell, faint but unmistakable old blood, rotted meat, active poaching site. Scout's hackles rose suddenly. The pup went rigid, staring downslope. Maida grabbed the rifle and thumbed off the safety. For a moment, nothing. Then voices, distant but growing closer. Men, their tone casual, heading this direction. She grabbed Scout's scruff and pulled the pup behind a fallen log 20 feet away. They crouched, hidden. Scout pressed against her, understanding the need for silence. The voices grew louder. 3 men emerged into the clearing, wearing camouflage, carrying rifles. They moved with confidence, knew the terrain, didn't expect to encounter anyone. Check the snares on the upper trail. one said. Older, maybe 60, weathered face, grey stubble. Johnson wants another 6 pelts by Friday. We've been running this ridge pretty hard, another replied. Younger, lean, sharp-faced. Might need to move to the South Valley. Let this area recover. The third grunted agreement. Heavy set, carrying extra weight. Found wolf sign near Timber Creek yesterday. Big pack, maybe 8 or 10. Good, the older man said. That's what we need. Set up the bait station. Maida listened, memorizing everything. Their faces, voices, the name Johnson. Evidence. The men spent 10 minutes checking the area, adjusting something, discussing logistics. Finally, they moved upslope, voices fading. Maida waited 5 minutes after silence before moving, her legs cramped from crouching. Scout emerged and shook itself, looked at her. We need to be more careful, Maida whispered. These men killed Michael. But she felt grim satisfaction. Her father had been right. The poaching hadn't ended. It had continued, probably with new people joining, and they were still active. They continued northeast, more cautiously. Scout ranged ahead but stayed closer. Every branch snap made Maida's pulse jump. She was 62, alone with dangerous criminals. Nearby, following her brother's trail. Reckless, foolish, possibly suicidal. But she kept walking. By evening, they were within a mile of Timber Creek Ridge. She could see it, a dramatic rock face rising from forest, technical climbing terrain. According to reports, Michael had fallen while climbing alone. But knowing what she knew now, Maida doubted he'd fallen. More likely pushed, or shot, and staged. She made camp in a hidden hollow, built no fire, ate cold rations. Scout pressed against her in darkness. Above, stars burned. She thought about calling for help. She had her satellite phone back at the cabin. She could hike back, make the call, bring authorities. That would be smart. Safe. But it would give the poachers time to disappear. They clearly had a sophisticated operation. The moment rangers showed up, they'd vanish, like after Michael's death. Her father had tried bringing in authorities then. Nothing came of it. No evidence, no witnesses, no proof. If she wanted justice, she'd have to get proof first. Real, solid evidence. Photos, maybe, or catching them in the act. Tomorrow, she'd reach Timber Creek Ridge, see where her brother died, figure out how to expose these men. She thought about Michael, 20 years old, trying to do right. About her father, carrying guilt and grief for decades. About her own life, 40 years guiding, a solid marriage, children who drifted away, widowhood at 62. What was she willing to risk? Everything, she realized. What did she have to lose? Tom was gone, her children barely called. She'd spent her life playing it safe, being practical, following rules. Maybe it was time to be brave. Time to finish what her brother started. Timber Creek Ridge rose before them like a monument. Maida stood at its base, studying the rock face where her brother had died. It was a challenging climb, not impossible, but requiring skill and equipment. Michael would have had both. He'd been experienced by age 20, which made the official story of an accidental fall less believable. Scout sat beside her, unusually still, sensing the weight of this place. The morning sun hadn't reached the cliff base, and shadows held a chill that made Maida pull her jacket tighter. She circled slowly, studying terrain. According to the accident report, Michael's body had been discovered at the eastern base, beneath an overhang 60 feet up. The fall would have been fatal. But had he fallen, or been pushed? After 40 years, the rock held no answers. Any evidence was gone, weathered away. But Maida hadn't expected forensic proof. She'd come to understand, to see what Michael had seen, to walk where he'd walked. Scout suddenly stood, ears forward, focused upslope. Maida followed the pup's gaze and saw it, a small structure through the trees. A cabin or shed. It sat on a rock shelf 300 yards up, tucked into forest, nearly invisible unless you knew where to look. Her father's map hadn't shown structures here, and Maida had never known this existed, which meant it was very old or very deliberately hidden. Scout started up the slope without waiting. Maida grabbed the rifle and followed, her knees protesting the steep grade. By the time she reached the shelf, she was breathing hard. The structure was definitely a cabin, though barely, maybe 12 by 12 feet, rough-cut logs, weathered silver grey. No windows, just a door with a padlock. The roof was corrugated metal, rusted but intact. Scout scratched at the door and whined. Maida examined the padlock. Newer than the cabin replaced within the last few years. Someone was maintaining this place. The men she'd overheard yesterday, this must be one of their supply caches. Before she could decide what to do, Scout's whining intensified. The pup wasn't just asking, it was distressed, agitated. Something inside was important to Scout personally. She made her decision. Used the rifle butt to smash the lock. It took 3 hits, but the mechanism gave way. The door swung open, and smell hit her animal musk, old meat, chemicals. She pulled her shirt over her nose and stepped inside. The cabin was dim. As her eyes adjusted, she saw the contents. Traps hung on walls, dozens of steel jaws and wire snares. Pelts stacked in one corner, mostly wolf, but also bear and lynx. In the center sat several large plastic containers, and in the back corner a cage, large enough for a medium dog or a wolf pup. Scout rushed to the cage and pawed at it frantically. Inside, Maida saw movement. 3 wolf pups, smaller than Scout, huddled together, alive but in poor condition, thin, dehydrated, terrified. Scout's siblings, the poachers had taken the whole litter. "Oh God," Maida whispered. She moved to the cage and flipped the latch. The pups didn't move at first, too scared. Scout climbed inside and nuzzled them, whining softly. Maida stepped back. While Scout encouraged its siblings, she looked around. On a makeshift table, papers, logs documenting kills, dates, locations, names of buyers, prices for pelts. This was it. The evidence her father had spent years searching for. She pulled out her phone and started taking pictures. Every page, every detail. The pelts, traps, cages, logs. Even here, she had enough signal to upload to cloud storage. If something happened to her, this evidence would survive. She was photographing the buyer list when she heard voices outside. Her blood turned to ice. The poachers were coming back. She had maybe 60 seconds. The pups were too weak to move quickly. Scout wouldn't leave them. She couldn't carry 4 wolves and the rifle. And if she ran, they'd hear her. She pushed Scout and the 3 pups deeper into the cabin, into the darkest corner. "Stay quiet," she whispered, "no matter what." Then she grabbed the rifle, slipped out, and circled around the cabin. Found a position behind a fallen log with a clear view of the door. She settled in, checked the magazine, chambered around. Her hands were steady, her breathing controlled. This was just another wilderness challenge. She'd faced charging bears, sudden storms, life-threatening injuries. She knew how to stay calm. The voices grew closer. 2 men, the older one from yesterday and the heavy-set one. They were arguing, words indistinct until they reached the cabin. "I'm telling you, Johnson's getting nervous," the older man said. "He thinks Fish and Wildlife is sniffing around again." "They've been sniffing around for 30 years, the heavy-set man replied. "They never find anything. That kid found something, back in '83. Maida's breath caught. They were talking about Michael. "Ancient history," the heavy-set man said. "We handled it. We handled it. Confirmation they'd murdered her brother." Maida's finger moved to the trigger. The older man reached the door and stopped. Locks broken. Both men went alert, hands moving to weapons. The heavy-set man pulled a pistol. "Someone's been here. Check inside." The heavy-set man pushed the door wider, peered in. "The pups await. The cage is open." "Trap," the older man said. "Someone's watching." They started to turn. Maida knew she had seconds. She stood, rifle raised, and stepped into view. "Don't move," she said, her voice steady. "Put the weapons down." Both men froze. The older one recovered first, studying her. "You're not a ranger." "No, I'm Jim Rusk's daughter." Recognition flickered. "Rusk, I remember him. The guide, back in '77. The one who saw too much. And his son Michael, who you murdered in 1983. You're going to tell me exactly what happened?" The older man laughed harshly. "You think you can march us out at gunpoint? Old woman, alone with 2 armed men? You don't have a prayer." "Maybe not," Maida said. "But I have something better. Evidence. Every page in that cabin, photographed and uploaded. Even if you kill me, the truth's already out." "She's bluffing," the heavy-set man said. "No cell signal." "There's enough," Maida said. "Check your own phones." The older man pulled out his phone, checked it. His face darkened. "There's signal. So here's how this works," Maida continued. "You're going to sit down and answer my questions, starting with what really happened to Michael Rusk." For a long moment, nobody moved. Then the older man sighed and sat down heavily. "Fine. What does it matter now? Your brother came poking around in '83, asking questions, threatening to expose us. We couldn't let that happen. So, yeah, we pushed him off that ridge, made it look like an accident." The casual admission hit Maida like a blow. She'd known, suspected, but hearing it confirmed, hearing this man dismiss her brother's murder so casually filled her with pure rage. "And my father?" she asked, voice tight. "Didn't have to threaten him. He was smart enough to know what would happen if he pushed it. He took his family and left." "It wasn't the end," Maida said. "He spent the rest of his life trying to expose you." "And failed," the man said with a shrug. "This is business. Wolf pelts fetch good money. We've been running this operation for 45 years. Scout emerged from the cabin, followed by the 3 pups. They moved as a group to stand beside Maida. The older man's eyes widened. "That's our breeding stock." "They're not yours," Maida interrupted. "They're wild animals you've been murdering for profit." From downslope came a sound helicopter rotors. Getting closer, the older man's face paled. "What did you do?" "I called the Rangers," Maida said calmly. 3 days ago, before I left the cabin, told them where I was going and why. Told them if they didn't hear from me by today, something was wrong." The helicopter crested the ridge, bright yellow. It circled once, then began descending. Maida kept the rifle trained until 4 Rangers emerged and climbed toward them, weapons drawn. Only then did she lower her weapon. It was over. Finally, after 40 years, it was over. The Rangers took the 2 men into custody while Maida sat on a rock, trying to stop shaking. The adrenaline that had kept her steady was draining away, leaving her exhausted. The lead ranger, a woman in her 40s named Sarah Chen, approached with a blanket and water. "Mrs. Rusk, are you hurt?" "I'm fine," Maida said, though her voice shook. "The wolf pups need help. They're dehydrated and starving." Chen nodded and called another ranger, who went into the cabin with a first aid kit. Scout and the 3 pups huddled near the door, watching everything warily. "Can you tell me what happened?" Chen asked, pulling out a notebook. Maida took a drink and began talking. She explained, finding the cabin, her father's investigation, Michael's murder disguised as an accident, the evidence she'd photographed. She talked about Scout leading her here, about the 45-year poaching operation. Chen listened without interrupting. When Maida finished, the ranger looked up. "Mrs. Rusk, what you did was incredibly brave and incredibly reckless. You could have been killed." "I know," Maida said, "but I couldn't let them get away with it. We'll need you to come back to town, give a formal statement. The evidence you collected will be crucial for prosecution." "I uploaded it to cloud storage," Maida said. "I can give you access." Chen smiled slightly. "You were prepared. 40 years as a wilderness guide teaches you to plan for contingencies." Over the next hour, more rangers arrived. They documented the cabin, collected evidence, examined the wolf pups. The veterinary ranger, Torres, reported the pups were malnourished but would recover. What will happen to them? Maida asked, watching Scout groom a smaller pup. They'll go to wildlife rehabilitation, Torres said. Once healthy, we'll try to reunite them with their pack. If that's not possible, they'll be released in suitable territory. And Scout, Torres looked at Scout, pressed against Maida's leg. That one's bonded to you? It's unusual, but happens with hand-raised wolves. The question is, how did it get hand-raised? One of the rangers emerged from the cabin holding a journal. You need to see this, he said to Chen. They gathered as he flipped through pages. It was a log, dating back several months. The entries were sparse but revealing. May 15. Found wolf den, 6 pups. Took 4 for breeding program. June 3, 3 pups died. 1 surviving, female, grey coat. Responding well to hand feeding. June 20, grey pup strong enough. Need to use it. Rusk's daughter still alive in Derby. The old man tried to expose us, maybe she will too. Send the pup to find her. Wolves always go home. Maida felt blood drain from her face. They sent Scout deliberately? Why? Chen read further. This doesn't make sense. Why would they want you to find them? The older poacher, still cuffed nearby, laughed bitterly. Because I'm not the one in charge. Johnson runs this operation, and Johnson wanted insurance. What kind of insurance? Chen demanded. The kind where, if anything went wrong, he had someone to blame. Someone to take the fall. He knew Rusk's daughter was a guide, knew she'd understand the mountains, knew she'd come looking if she got the right push. That's what the pup was bait. Lead her here, let her find just enough evidence, and then, he shrugged. Accidents happen in the backcountry. The implications hit Maida hard. She'd thought she was clever, following Scout, finding the cabin, getting evidence. But she'd been played from the beginning. Scout hadn't escaped. Scout had been released, orchestrated to draw her into a trap. But it didn't work, Chen said slowly, because you called us first. Luck, the man said. Pure luck. Johnson's plan was solid. Where is Johnson now? Don't know. He's smart. Probably realized things went sideways and disappeared. Chen turned to Maida. Did you see anyone else? Any indication of other people? Maida thought back. The voices, the fresh tracks, the 3 men. There was a third man, younger, lean, sharp-faced, and they mentioned Johnson wanting 6 pelts by Friday. Can you describe the third man? Maida closed her eyes, pulling up the memory. Late 20s, early 30s. About 5 to 10, 160, dark hair, shaggy. Scar on his left cheek. Here. She indicated the location. Carrying a Remington rifle. Well maintained. Chen wrote quickly. Good. That's helpful. We'll get that description out. Another ranger approached. Ma'am, we found something else. A radio setup. Sophisticated. They've been coordinating with multiple sites. How many sites? At least 6, based on logs. This operation is bigger than we thought. Chen swore under her breath. All right. We need to move fast before they scatter. Torres, you and Martinez take the pups and Mrs. Rusk back to town. Get her statement. The rest of us will start hitting the other locations. I want to help, Maida said. Chen looked at her with sympathy. Mrs. Rusk, you've done more than enough. You've given us the break we needed. But this is law enforcement work now. The best thing you can do is go home, rest, and let us handle it. Maida wanted to argue, but she was too tired. Her body ached from days of hiking and the confrontation stress, and she needed to think, to process everything. What about Scout? She asked. Torres knelt beside the wolf pup. Scout allowed the contact but kept looking at Maida. Like I said, this one's bonded to you. Normally we'd send it to rehabilitation with the others. But, he paused, in cases where a wolf has been hand-raised and imprinted on a human, sometimes the kindest thing is to acknowledge that bond. especially given this wolf was deliberately used as a tool. It's not a normal wolf anymore. Are you saying I can keep Scout? It's complicated. There are regulations, permits required. But given the circumstances, and given that you live in a rural area and have experience to handle a wolf safely, we can probably work something out. Relief flooded through Maida. She'd grown attached to Scout more than she'd realized. The thought of losing the pup now was unbearable. They loaded into the helicopter Maida, Scout, the 3 other pups in carriers, Torres and Martinez. As they lifted off, Maida looked down at Timber Creek Ridge, at the cabin full of secrets, at the place her brother died. She'd come into these mountains to escape grief over Tom. Instead, she'd found different grief, older, deeper, tangled with family secrets and crimes echoing across decades. But she'd also found purpose, justice, and maybe a way forward. Scout pressed against her as the helicopter banked south toward Derby. Maida wrapped an arm around the pup and allowed herself to believe that maybe, finally, things would be okay. But a nagging thought remained. Johnson, the man in charge, was still out there. The operation had been disrupted, but was it over? Or had she only touched the surface? The helicopter flew over familiar terrain, valleys she'd guided through, peaks she'd climbed, rivers she'd fished, her mountains, her home. And somewhere down there, possibly watching, was a man who'd built an empire on protected species bones. She thought about her father, about the guilt he'd carried until death, about Michael, barely 20 when he'd tried to do right, about Tom, who'd never known any of this existed. The helicopter began its descent into Derby. Below, she could see the town, small, familiar, safe. Her house was down there, still empty, still waiting. Her old life, ready to resume. But Maida knew she couldn't go back to that life. Not after this. Something had changed in her over the past 11 days. She'd remembered who she used to be before she buried her past, before she became the practical, cautious woman who guided tourists and kept her distance from anything painful. She'd remembered that she came from people who fought for what was right. Her father had tried. Michael had died trying. And now it was her turn to finish it. When they landed and she gave her statement, she'd tell them everything. Every detail, every observation, every instinct from 40 years in these mountains. She'd help them find Johnson and dismantle his operation completely. And then she'd figure out what came next. Maybe reach out to her children, try to rebuild those bridges. Maybe turn her father's cabin into something positive, the wildlife observation station she'd imagined. Maybe just live, really live, instead of going through the motions. Scout licked her hand, and Maida smiled. Whatever came next, at least she wouldn't be alone. The helicopter touched down in Derby just after noon. A crowd had gathered, word spread fast in small towns. Maida saw familiar faces, people she'd known for decades, watching with curiosity as she climbed out with Scout at her side. Frank Kowalski pushed through the crowd, his weathered face creased with worry. "Maida, we heard something happened. Are you all right?" "I'm fine, Frank," she said, though she was suddenly aware of how she must look dirty, exhausted, clothes torn from bushwhacking. Chen stepped forward, keeping the crowd back. "Mrs. Rusk needs to come with us to give a statement. She's not hurt, but she's been through an ordeal. Please give her space." They ushered Maida into the ranger station, a small building on Main Street. Scout followed, refusing to leave her side. Inside, Chen led her to a conference room and brought coffee, water, and sandwiches. "When did you last eat?" Chen asked. Maida had to think. "Yesterday morning. Cold rations. Eat first. Then we'll talk." Maida ate mechanically while Scout lay at her feet. The food helped, bringing back strength and clarity. When she finished, Chen pulled out a recording device and legal pad. "All right, I'm going to record this. Start from the beginning. When did you first encounter the wolf pup?" Maida walked through everything. Tom's death, her decision to go into the mountains alone, the third morning when Scout appeared. The injured paw and rope collar, the way Scout had seemed to lead her deliberately. She described finding the toy truck, the photograph, the cabin, reading Michael's journal and her father's guilty letters. The revelation that her brother hadn't died in an accident but had been murdered. Chen's expression grew darker. "And you didn't call for backup until you reached Timber Creek Ridge?" "I called from the cabin 3 days before I reached the ridge. I told dispatch where I was heading and that if they didn't hear from me by yesterday, something was wrong. I knew I was walking into danger." Chen nodded approvingly. "Smart. That probably saved your life. When you didn't check in, we scrambled the helicopter. We were already en route when you made the arrest." "I didn't arrest anyone. I just kept them at gunpoint. You stopped armed criminals and secured crucial evidence. That's more than most civilians would do." They continued for another hour, Chen asking detailed questions about the poachers, what they'd said, the cabin's layout, the log's contents. Maida answered everything thoroughly, her memory surprisingly sharp, despite exhaustion. Finally, Chen set down her pen. "All right, that should be enough for now. We may need follow-up questions, but you've given us a solid foundation." "What happens next?" Maida asked. "We're coordinating with FBI and Fish and Wildlife. This crosses state lines and involves protected species, so it's federal jurisdiction. Based on what you've told us and the evidence, we're looking at a multi-state criminal enterprise. The 2 men we arrested are small players. Johnson is the real target. Will you find him?" "We'll try. But men like that, who've run operations this long, they're good at disappearing. He probably has multiple identities. Offshore accounts, contingency plans." Maida felt frustration. After everything, the man responsible might vanish. "And the operation itself, is it over? The sites we know about, we're hitting now, but there could be others. It'll take time to dismantle completely." Chen paused. "Mrs. Rusk, Maida, what you did was extraordinary. You've given us a chance to bring down something that's been going on since before I was born. Your brother would be proud." Tears stung Maida's eyes. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. "Go home," Chen said gently. "Rest. Take care of your wolf friend. We'll be in touch." Frank was waiting outside to drive her home. He didn't ask questions, just helped her into his truck. Maida watched the familiar streets past the diner, where she and Tom had breakfast on Sundays, the hardware store where she'd bought camping supplies for 40 years, the library where she'd taken her children. Everything looked the same, but felt different. Or maybe she was different. Frank pulled into her driveway. The house looked exactly as she'd left it 11 days ago, small, tidy, empty. "You need anything?" Frank asked. "No. Thank you for the ride." "Maida." He paused. "I knew your father. Guided with him a few times back in the 70s. He was a good man, but he carried something heavy. I never knew what. Now I do. I'm sorry for what happened to your brother, and I'm glad you finally got the truth." Maida squeezed his hand. "Thank you, Frank." She climbed out, Scout following. The pup sniffed the yard cautiously, taking in new smells, new territory. Maida unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The house smelled stale, unlived in. Tom's coffee cup still sat on the counter, his jacket still hung by the door. She'd left to escape these reminders, and now she was back, carrying different losses, but also something else, completion, maybe, or resolution. Scout padded through the house, exploring, then returned to Maida's side and looked up. "This is home now," Maida told the pup, "for both of us." The call came 3 days later. Maida was in her backyard, building a proper enclosure for Scout. The pup needed space to roam but couldn't be fully wild. The vet had confirmed Scout was healthy but permanently imprinted on humans. Her phone rang. Chen's name. "Mrs. Rusk, I'm calling with an update. We've made significant progress." Maida set down her hammer. "What kind of progress?" "We've arrested 14 people connected to the poaching operation across 3 states. We've shut down 6 active sites and recovered evidence of over 200 wolf kills in the past 5 years alone." And Chen paused. "We found Johnson." Maida's heart jumped. "Where?" "Canada, trying to cross into Alaska. He had a false passport and 50,000 in cash. But we had his description from the younger poacher we arrested. He gave up Johnson in exchange for a plea deal. Will Johnson stand trial? He's being extradited now. Between your evidence, the physical evidence, and testimony from other poachers, we have a solid case. The prosecutor thinks we're looking at 20 years minimum, possibly life." Maida sat down heavily on the porch steps. 20 years. Life. For Michael's murder, for her father's years of guilt, for all the wolves killed over 4 decades. "There's something else," Chen continued. "We found more journals at Johnson's residence. He'd been documenting the operation since 1973, including detailed accounts of—" She hesitated. "Of your brother's death. I'm sorry, but it confirms what you suspected. It wasn't an accident. They lured him to Timber Creek Ridge and pushed him. Johnson himself did it." Rage and grief warred in Maida's chest, but underneath was validation. Her father had been right. Michael deserved justice, and now, finally, he was getting it. "Thank you," Maida said quietly, "for telling me. We couldn't have done it without you. The evidence you collected, the risks you took, that's what broke this open." After the call ended, Maida sat on the porch for a long time, Scout's head on her lap. The pup had settled into domestic life surprisingly well, though it still howled at night sometimes. Her phone rang again. David, her son. She almost didn't answer. Their conversations were always strained, but something made her pick up. "Mom, I just saw the news about the poaching ring, about Uncle Michael. Why didn't you tell me?" "I didn't know myself until recently," Maida said. "Your grandfather kept it hidden. The news says you're the one who broke the case, that you went into the mountains alone and found evidence." "That's more or less true." Silence. Then, "That's the most badass thing I've ever heard." "Mom, I had no idea I knew you were a guide, but I didn't know you were brave." "Neither did I, honestly. Can I come visit? I want to hear the whole story, and I want you to meet your grandkids properly. They should know who their grandmother really is." Tears spilled down Maida's cheeks. "I'd like that, David. I'd like that very much." After they hung up, Lynn called with a similar reaction: shock, pride, a desire to reconnect. Maida sat on her porch, Scout beside her, and felt something shift. The distance between her and her children hadn't been permanent. It just needed the right catalyst. That evening, she drove out to the cemetery. She hadn't been since Tom's funeral, couldn't bring herself to face his grave. But now she walked directly to it, knelt in the grass, and talked to him like he was sitting beside her. She told him about Scout, about the cabin, about Michael and her father, and the 40-year secret. She told him about the arrests, about Johnson being caught, about justice finally being served. And she told him she was sorry for the distance in their marriage, for not being fully present, for carrying ghosts he never knew about. "I'm going to be better," she said aloud. "I'm going to actually live instead of just existing. I'm going to know my grandchildren. I'm going to turn that cabin into something good. And I'm going to take care of Scout." The sun was setting as she walked to Michael's grave nearby. It was smaller, older, the stone weathered. She knelt and placed her hand on it. "They know now," she said. "Everyone knows what happened to you, and the man who did it is going to pay. Dad tried for years to get you justice. I finished what he started. I hope you can both rest now." Scout nuzzled her hand, and Maida stood. The cemetery was peaceful in the fading light, and for the first time in months, maybe years, she felt at peace too. 6 months later, Maida stood on the porch of her father's cabin, watching the sun rise over the Bitterroot Mountains. The structure looked different, now restored, cleaned, with new windows and a reinforced roof. But the bones were the same, and the sign at the clearing's edge still read, "Rusk family camp, though she'd added a line underneath, Maida Rusk Wildlife Observation Station. Scout sat beside her, fully grown now, a beautiful wolf with grey-brown fur and intelligent yellow eyes. The pup had become her constant companion, adapting to hybrid life, wild enough to roam the forest during the day, tame enough to sleep on the porch at night. The sound of a vehicle made Scout's ears prick. Maida smiled. Company. David's truck pulled into the clearing, and her grandchildren tumbled out. Emma, 7, and Jake, 10. They'd been to the cabin 3 times now, each visit growing more comfortable with wilderness, more curious about their great-uncle Michael. Grandma. Emma ran up the steps and hugged Maida's waist. Is Scout here? Can we go hiking? Scout's right here. And yes, we can hike after breakfast. Your dad and I need to check the trail cameras first. David climbed the steps more slowly, carrying supplies. He looked relaxed, younger somehow. Morning, Mom. Beautiful day. It is, Maida agreed. They ate breakfast together while Scout lay under the table, accepting scraps from the children. After, while David and the kids explored the creek, Maida hiked up to check the cameras she'd installed around the property. The wildlife observation station was becoming real. She documented 3 wolf packs in the area, plus bears, elk, mountain lions. The footage went to researchers at the university, contributing to conservation efforts. It felt right, using this place to protect the animals her brother had died trying to save. Lynn arrived that afternoon with her husband and teenage daughter. The cabin was crowded now, full of noise and laughter and family chaos. Maida cooked dinner on the old wood stove while her grandchildren ran in and out, Scout following like a patient guardian. That evening, after the kids were in bed, the adults sat on the porch. David asked about the trial Johnson's had concluded last month. Maida told them about testifying, about facing the man who'd murdered Michael and never shown remorse, about the life sentence he'd received. Do you think Dad would be proud? Lynn asked. Grandpa, I mean. I think he'd be relieved, Maida said. He carried that guilt for so long, knowing it's finally resolved. I think he can rest now. They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the forest settle. Scout howled once, a long, mournful sound, and somewhere in the distance another wolf answered. Scout's siblings, maybe, or another pack. Either way, Scout didn't seem lonely. Later, alone in the cabin, Maida opened Michael's journal to the last entry. She'd read it dozens of times, but it still moved her. The 2nd of August 1977, last day at the cabin. I don't know if we'll ever come back. But if someone finds this someday, I want them to know this place was special. We were happy here. And some things are worth protecting, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. She closed the journal and placed it on the mantel, next to her father's hunting knife and the toy truck. Artifacts of a family's history, no longer hidden. On impulse, she picked up her phone and called her children's group chat. Thank you for coming this weekend, she typed. I know I wasn't always present when you were growing up. I'm trying to be better. I love you both. The responses came quickly. Heart emojis from Lynn. Love you too, Mom, from David. Simple, but enough. She stepped out onto the porch one last time. Scout rose and pressed against her legs. Together they looked out at the mountains, dark shapes against a star-filled sky. 3 months after Tom died, Maida had come to these mountains seeking silence and solitude, wanting nothing but to escape her grief. Instead, she'd found a wolf pup that wouldn't leave, a family secret that demanded resolution, and a purpose she'd been missing. She'd found the truth about her brother's death and brought his killers to justice. She'd reconnected with children she'd almost lost. She'd turned a place of buried pain into something that honored Michael's memory and contributed to the wilderness he'd loved. And she'd learned something about herself, that grief doesn't have to be the end. That 62 isn't too old to be brave. That sometimes the path through loss leads exactly where you need to be. Scout howled again, and Maida found herself smiling. She wasn't alone anymore. She had family, both human and otherwise. She had purpose. She had this place, these mountains, this wild, beautiful world that had saved her. "Come on," she said to the wolf. "Let's go inside. Tomorrow's another day." They went into the cabin together, and Maida closed the door on the night, but not on the future. That was just beginning.